Hans Christian Andersen, Fairytales and Short Stories, Volume 6, 1866 to 1873, by Hans Christian Andersen. Translated by H. B. Paul. The Flea and the Professor. Published in Scribner's Monthly, Volume 5, Issue 6, April 1873. There was once an aeronaut with whom things went badly. The balloon burst, tumbled the man out, and broke into bits. His boy he had 2 minutes before sent down with a parachute. That was the boy's luck. He was unhurt, and went about with knowledge enough to make him an aeronaut too, but he had no balloon and no means of acquiring one. But live he must, and so he applied himself to the art of legerdemain, and to talking in his stomach. In fact, he became a ventriloquist, as they say. He was young, good-looking, and when he got a moustache and had his best clothes on, he could be taken for a nobleman's son. The ladies seemed to think well of him. One young lady even was so taken with his charms and his great dexterity that she went off with him to foreign parts. There he called himself Professor. He could scarcely do less. His constant thought was how to get himself a balloon and go up in the air with his little wife, but as yet they had no means. "They'll come yet," said he. "If only they would," said she. "We are young folks," said he, "and now I am Professor." She helped him faithfully, sat at the door and sold tickets to the exhibition, and it was a chilly sort of pleasure in winter time. She also helped him in the line of his art. He put his wife in a table drawer, a large table drawer, then she crawled into the back part of the drawer, and so was not in the front part, quite an optical illusion to the audience. But one evening when he drew the drawer out, she was also out of sight to him. She was not in the front drawer, not in the back one either, not in the house itself, nowhere to be seen or heard. That was her feat of legerdemain, her entertainment. She never came back again. She was tired of it all, and he grew tired of it, lost his good humour, could not laugh or make jokes. And so the people stopped coming, his earnings became scanty, his clothes gave out, and finally he only owned a great flea, which his wife had left him, and so he thought highly of it. And he dressed the flea, and taught it to perform, to present arms, and to fire a cannon off, but it was a little cannon. The Professor was proud of the flea, and the flea was proud of himself. He had learnt something, and had human blood, and had been besides to the largest cities, had been seen by princes and princesses, had received their high praise, and it was printed in the newspaper and on placards. Plainly it was a very famous flea, and could support a professor and his entire family. The flea was proud and famous, and yet when he and the Professor travelled, they took fourth-class carriages on the railway. They went just as quickly as the first class. They were betrothed to each other. It was a private engagement that would never come out. They never would marry. The flea would remain a bachelor, and the Professor a widower. That made it balance. "Where one has the best luck," said the Professor, "there one ought to go twice." He was a good judge of character, and that is also a science of itself. At last he had travelled over all countries except the wild ones, and so he wanted to go there. They each Christian men there, to be sure, the Professor knew, but then he was not properly Christian, and the flea was not properly a man, so he thought they might venture to travel there and have good success. They travelled by steamship and by sailing vessel. The flea performed his tricks, and so they got a free passage on the way and arrived at the wild country. Here reigned a little princess. She was only 8 years old, but she was reigning. She had taken away the power from her father and mother, for she had a will, and then she was extraordinarily beautiful. And rude. Just as soon as the flea had presented arms and fired off the cannon, she was so enraptured with him that she said, "Him or nobody!" She became quite wild with love, and was already wild in other ways. "Sweet little sensible child," said her own father, "if one could only first make a man of him." "Leave that to me, old man," said she, and that was not well said by a little princess when talking with her father, but she was wild. She set the flea on her white hand. "Now you are a man, reigning with me, but you shall do what I want you to, or else I'll kill you and eat the Professor." The Professor had a great hall to live in. The walls were made of sugar cane, and he could lick them, but he was not a sweet tooth. He had a hammock to sleep in. It was as if he were lying in a balloon, such as he had always wished for himself. That was his constant thought. The flea lived with the Princess, sat upon her delicate hand and upon her white neck. She had taken a hair from her head and made the Professor tie it to the flea's leg. and so she kept him tied to the great red coral drop which she wore in her ear tip. What a delightful time the Princess had, and the Flea too, she thought, but the Professor was not very comfortable. He was a traveller, he liked to drive from town to town, and read about its perseverance and cleverness in teaching a flea to do what men do. But he got out of and into his hammock, lounged about and had good feeding, fresh birds' eggs, elephants' eyes, and roast giraffe. People that eat men do not live entirely on cooked men. No, that is a great delicacy. Shoulder of children with sharp sauce, said the Princess's mother, is the most delicate. The Professor was tired of it all and would rather go away from the wild land, but he must have his flea with him, for that was his prodigy, and his bread and butter. How was he to get hold of him? That was no easy matter. He strained all his wits, and then he said, "Now I have it. Princess's father, grant me a favour. May I summon your subjects to present themselves before your Royal Highness? That is what is called a ceremony in the high and mighty countries of the world." "Can I, too, learn to do that?" asked the Princess's father. "That is not quite proper," replied the Professor, "but I shall teach your wild fatherships to fire a cannon off. It goes off with a bang. One sits high up aloft, and then off it goes or down he comes." "Let me crack it off," said the Princess's father, but in all the land there was no cannon except the one the Flea had brought, and that was so very small. "I will cast a bigger one," said the Professor, "only give me the means. I must have fine silk stuff, needle and thread, rope and cord, together with cordial drops for the balloon. They blow one up so easily and give one the heaves. They are what make the report in the cannons inside." "By all means," said the Princess's father, and gave him what he called for. All the court and the entire population came together to see the great cannon cast. The Professor did not summon them before he had the balloon entirely ready to be filled and go up. The Flea sat on the Princess's hand and looked on. The balloon was filled, it bulged out and could scarcely be held down, so violent did it become. "I must have it up in the air before it can be cooled off," said the Professor, and took his seat in the car which hung below. "But I cannot manage and steer it alone. I must have a skilful companion along to help me. There is no one here that can do that except the Flea." "I am not very willing to let him," said the Princess, but still she reached out and handed the Flea to the Professor, who placed him on his hand. "Let go of the cords and ropes," he shouted. "Now the balloon's going." They thought he said the cannon, and so the balloon went higher and higher up above the clouds, far away from the wild land. The little Princess, all the family, and the people sat and waited. They are waiting still, and if you do not believe it, just take a journey to the wild land. Every child there talks about the Professor and the Flea, and believes that they are coming back when the cannon is cooled off. But they will not come. They are at home with us. They are in their native country. They travel on the railway, first class, not fourth. They have good success, a great balloon. Nobody asks how they got a balloon, or where it came from. They are rich folks now, quite respectable folks indeed. The Flea and the Professor. End of The Flea and the Professor.
Hans Christian Andersen, Fairy Tales and Short Stories, Volume 6, 1866 to 1873, by Hans Christian Andersen, translated by H. P. Paul. Chapter 24. The Gardener and the Manor, by Hans Christian Andersen. About 1 Danish mile from the capital stood an old manor house with thick walls, towers, and pointed gable ends. Here lived, but only in the summer season, a rich and courtly family. The manor house was the best and the most beautiful of all the houses they owned. It looked outside as if it had just been cast in a foundry, and within it was comfort itself. The family arms were carved in stone over the door. Beautiful roses twined about the arms and the balcony. A grass plot extended before the house with red thorn and white thorn, and many rare flowers grew even outside the conservatory. The manor kept also a very skilful gardener. It was a real pleasure to see the flower garden, the orchard, and the kitchen garden. There was still to be seen a portion of the Manor's original garden, a few box-tree hedges cut in shape of crowns and pyramids, and behind these 2 mighty old trees almost always without leaves. One might almost think that a storm or waterspout had scattered great lumps of manure on their branches, but each lump was a bird's nest. A swarm of rooks and crows from time immemorial had built their nests there. It was a town full of birds, and the birds were the manorial lords here. They did not care for the proprietors, the Manor's oldest family branch, nor for the present owner of the Manor. These were nothing to them, but they bore the wandering creatures below them, notwithstanding that once in a while they shot with guns in a way that made the bird's backbone shiver, and made every bird fly up, crying "Rock, rock!" The gardener very often explained to the master the necessity of felling the old trees, as they did not look well, and by taking them away they would probably get rid of the screaming birds which would seek another place. But he never could be induced either to give up the trees or the swarm of birds the Manor could not spare them, as they were relics of the good old times that ought to be kept in remembrance. "The trees are the birds' heritage by this time," said the master, "so let them keep them, my good Larsen." Larsen was the gardener's name, but that is of very little consequence in this story. "Haven't you room enough to work in, little Larsen? Have you not the flower garden, the greenhouses, the orchard, and the kitchen garden?" He cared for them. He kept them in order and cultivated them with zeal and ability, and the family knew it, but they did not conceal from him that they often tasted fruits and saw flowers in other houses that surpassed what he had in his garden, and that was a sore trial for the gardener, who always wished to do the best, and really did the best he could. He was a good-hearted and faithful servant. The owner sent one day for him, and told him kindly that the day before, at a party given by some friends of rank, they had eaten apples and pears which were so juicy and well flavoured that all the guests had loudly expressed their admiration. To be sure, they were not native fruits, but they ought by all means to be introduced here, and to be acclimatized if possible. They learned that the fruit was bought of one of the first fruit dealers in the city, and the gardener was to ride to town and find out about where they came from, and then order some slips for grafting. The gardener was very well acquainted with the dealer, because he was the very person to whom he sold the fruit that grew in the Manor garden beyond what was needed by the family. So the gardener went to town and asked the fruit dealer where he had found those apples and pears that were praised so highly. "They are from your own garden," said the fruit dealer, and he showed him both the apples and pears, which he recognized. Now how happy the gardener felt! He hastened back to his master, and told him that the apples and pears were all from his own garden, but he would not believe it. "It cannot be possible, Larsen. Can you get a written certificate of that from the fruit dealer?" And he could, and brought him a written certificate. And now every day were set on the table great dishes filled with beautiful apples and pears from their own garden. Bushels and barrels of these fruits were sent to friends in the city and country, nay, were even sent abroad. It was exceedingly pleasant, but when they talked with the gardener they said that the last 2 seasons had been remarkably favourable for fruits, and that fruits had done well all over the country. Some time passed. The family were at dinner at court. The next day the gardener was sent for. They had eaten melons at the royal table, which they found very juicy and well flavoured. They came from His Majesty's greenhouse. "You must go and see the court gardener, and let him give you some seeds of those melons." "But the gardener at the court got his melon seeds from us," said the gardener, highly delighted. "But then that man understands how to bring the fruit to a higher perfection," was the answer. "Each particular melon was delicious." "Well then, I really may feel proud," said the gardener. "I must tell your lordship that the gardener at the court did not succeed very well with his melons this year, and so, seeing how beautiful ours look, he tasted them and ordered from me 3 of them for the castle." "Larsen, do not pretend to say that those were melons from our garden." "Really, I dare say as much," said the gardener, who went to the court gardener and got from him a written certificate to the effect that the melons on the royal table were from the Manor. That was certainly a great surprise to the family, and they did not keep the story to themselves. Melon seeds were sent far and wide, in the same way as had been done with the slips, which they were now hearing had begun to take, and to bear fruit of an excellent kind. The fruit was named after the Manor, and the name was written in English, German, and French. This was something they never had dreamed of. "We are afraid that the gardener will come to think too much of himself," said they. But he looked on it in another way. What he wished was to get the reputation of being one of the best gardeners in the country, and to produce every year something exquisite out of all sorts of garden stuff, and that he did. But he often had to hear that the fruits which he first bought, the apples and pears, were after all the best. All other kinds of fruit were inferior to these. The melons, too, were very good, but they belonged to quite another species. His strawberries were very excellent, but by no means better than many others, and when it happened one year that his radishes did not succeed, they only spoke of them, and not of other good things he had made succeed. It really seemed as if the family felt some relief in saying, "It won't turn out well this year, little Larsen." They seemed quite glad when they could say, "It won't turn out well." The gardener used always twice a week to bring them fresh flowers, tastefully arranged, and the colours by his arrangements were brought out in stronger light. "You have good taste, Larsen," said the owner, "but that is a gift from our Lord, not from yourself." One day the gardener brought a great crystal vase, with a floating leaf of white water lily, upon which was laid, with its long thick stalk descending into the water, a sparkling blue flower as large as a sunflower. "The sacred lotos of Hindostan!" exclaimed the family. They had never seen such a flower. It was placed every day in the sunshine, and in the evening under artificial light. Every one who saw it found it wonderfully beautiful and rare, and that said the most noble young lady in the country, the wise and kind-hearted Princess. The lord of the manor deemed it an honour to present her with the flower, and the Princess took it with her to the castle. Now the master of the house went down to the garden to pluck another flower of the same sort, but he could not find any. So he sent for the gardener, and asked him where he kept the blue lotus. "I have been looking for it in vain," said he. "I went into the conservatory, and round about the flower garden. No, it is not there," said the gardener. "It is nothing else than a common flower from the kitchen garden. But do you not find it beautiful? It looks as if it was the blue cactus, and yet it is only a kitchen herb. It is the flower of the artichoke." "You should have told us that at the time," said the master. "We supposed, of course, that it was a strange and rare flower. You have made us ridiculous in the eyes of the young Princess. She saw the flower in our house and thought it beautiful. She did not know the flower, and she is versed in botany too. But then that has nothing to do with kitchen herbs. How could you take it into your head, my good Larsen, to put such a flower up in our drawing room? It makes us ridiculous." And the magnificent blue flower from the kitchen garden was turned out of the drawing room, which was not at all the place for it. The master made his apology to the Princess, telling her that it was only a kitchen herb which the gardener had taken into his head to exhibit, but that he had been well reprimanded for it. "That was a pity," said the Princess, "for he has really opened our eyes to see the beauty of a flower in a place where we should not have thought of looking for it. Our gardener shall every day, as long as the artichoke is in bloom, bring one of them up into the drawing room." Then the master told his gardener that he might again bring a fresh artichoke flower. "It is, after all, a very nice flower," said he, "and a truly remarkable one." And so the gardener was praised again. "Larsen likes that," said the master. "He is a spoiled child." In the autumn there came up a great gale, which increased so violently in the night, that several large trees in the outskirts of the wood were torn up by the roots, and to the great grief of the household, but to the gardener's delight, the two big trees blew down, with all their birds' nests on them. In the manor house they heard during the storm the screaming of rooks and crows, beating their wings against the windows. "Now I suppose you are happy, Larsen," said the master. "The storm has felled the trees, and the birds have gone off to the woods. There is nothing left from the good old days. It is all gone, and we are very sorry for it." The gardener said nothing, but he thought of what he long had turned over in his mind. How could he make that pretty sunny spot very useful, so that it could become an ornament to the garden and a pride to the family? The great trees which had been blown down had shattered the venerable hedge of box that was cut into fanciful shapes. Here he set out a multitude of plants that were not to be seen in other gardens. He made an earthen wall, on which he planted all sorts of native flowers from the fields and woods. What no other gardener had ever thought of planting in the manor garden, he planted, giving each its appropriate soil, and the plants were in sunlight or shadow according as each species required. He cared tenderly for them, and they grew up finely. The juniper tree from the heaths of Jutland rose in shape and colour like the Italian cypress; the shining, thorny Christ-thorn, as green in the winter's cold as in the summer sun, was splendid to see. In the foreground grew ferns of various species; some of them looked as if they were children of the palm tree, others as if they were parents of the pretty plants called Venus's golden locks or maiden's hair. Here stood the despised burdock, which is so beautiful in its freshness that it looks well even in a bouquet. The burdock stood in a dry place, but below, in the moist soil, grew the coltsfoot, also a despised plant, but yet most picturesque with its tall stem and large leaf. Like a candelabrum, with a multitude of branches 6 feet high, and with flower over against flower, rose the mullein, a mere field plant. Here stood the woodroof and the lily of the valley, the wild calla, and the fine 3-leaved wood sorrel. It was a wonder to see all this beauty. In the front grew in rows very small pear trees from French soil, trained on wires. By plenty of sun and good care they soon bore as juicy fruits as in their own country. Instead of the 2 old leafless trees was placed a tall flagstaff, where the flag of Dannebrog was displayed, and near by stood another pole, with the hob tendril in summer or harvest time wound its fragrant flowers, but in winter time, after ancient custom, oaked sheaves were fastened to it, that the birds of the air might find here a good meal in the happy Christmas time. "Our good Larson is growing sentimental as he grows old," said the family, "but he is faithful and quite attached to us." In one of the illustrated papers there was a picture at New Year's of the old manor, with the flagstaff and the oat sheaves for the birds of the air, and the paper said that the old manor had preserved that beautiful old custom, and deserved great credit for it. "They beat the drum for all Larson's doing," said the family. "He is a lucky fellow, and we may almost be proud of having such a man at our service." But they were not a bit proud of it. They were very well aware that they were the lords of the manor. They could give Larson warning, in fact, but they did not. They were good people, and fortunate it is for every Mr. Larson that there are so many good people like them. Yes, that is the story of the gardener and the manor. Now you may think a little about it. End of chapter 24. The Gardener and the Manor.
Hans Christian Andersen, Fairytales and Short Stories, Volume 6, 1866 to 1873, by Hans Christian Andersen, translated by H.P. Paul. The Great Sea-Serpent. There was a little fish, a saltwater fish, of good family. I don't recall the name. You will have to get that from the learned people. This little fish had 1,800 brothers and sisters, all just as old as he. They did not know their father and mother, and were obliged to look out for themselves at the very beginning, and swim round, but that was great sport. They had water enough to drink, the entire ocean. They thought nothing about their food. It came when they wanted it. Each did as it pleased. Each was to make out its own story. Rather none of them thought at all about that. The sun shone down on the water that was light about them, so clear was it. It was a world with the strangest creatures, and some very horrid and big, with great gaping mouths that could gulp down all the 1,800 brothers and sisters. But neither did they think of that, for none of them as yet had been swallowed. The small ones swam side by side close together, as herrings and mackerel swim. But as they were swimming, their prettiest in the water, and thinking of nothing, there sank with a prodigious noise from above, right down through them, a long, heavy thing that looked as if it would never come to an end. It stretched out farther and farther, and every one of the little fishes that scampered off was either crushed or got a crack that it could not stand. All the little fishes, and the great ones with them, from the level of the sea to the bottom, were thrown into a panic. The great horrid thing sank deeper and deeper, and grew longer and longer, miles and miles long. The fishes and snails, everything that swims or creeps or is driven by the current, saw this fearful thing, this enormous, incomprehensible sea-eel, which had come down upon them in this fashion. What was the thing, anyway? We know. It was the great interminable telegraph cable that people were laying between Europe and America. There was a confusion and commotion amongst all the rightful occupants of the sea where the cable was laid. The flying fishes shot up above the surface as high as they could fling themselves. The blowfish took a leap an entire gunshot in length over the water, for it can do that. The other fish made for the bottom of the sea, and went down with such haste that they reached it long before the telegraph was seen or known about down there. They poured in on the cod and flounders that lived peaceably at the bottom of the sea and ate their neighbors. One or two of the sea anemones were so agitated that they threw up their stomachs, but they lived on after it just the same, for they can do that. A good many lobsters and crabs got out of their excellent shells and were obliged to wait for their bones to grow back again. In all this fright and confusion, the 1,800 brethren and sisters became separated, and never again met or even knew each other after that. Only some 10 of them remained still in the same place, and so in a few hours they got over the first fright and began to be curious about the affair. They looked about them, they looked up, and they looked down, and down in the depths they fancied they saw the fearful thing that had scared them. Yes, had scared all, great and small, lying on the bottom of the sea, as far as their eyes could reach. It was quite thin, but they did not know how thick it might be able to make itself, or how strong it was. It lay very quiet, but then that might be part of its cunning, they thought. "Let it lie, it does not come near us," said the most cautious of the little fishes. But the smallest one of all would not give up trying to find out what the thing could be. It had come down from above, so it was up above that one could best find out about it. So they swam up to the surface. It was perfectly still. They met a dolphin there. The dolphin is a sprightly fellow that can turn somersaults on the water, and it has eyes to see with, so it must have seen this and known all about it. They asked him, but he had only been thinking about himself and his somersaults. He had seen nothing, had no answer for them, and only looked high and mighty. Then they turned to the seal, which was just plunging in. It was more civil, for all that it eats small fish, but today it had had enough. It knew a little more than the dolphin. "Many a night have I lain upon a whetstone and looked far into the country. Miles away from here there are crafty creatures called in their speech men-folk. They plot against us, but usually we slip away from them. That I know well, and the sea-eel too, that you're asking about, he knows it. He has been under their sway, up there on the earth, time out of mind, and it was from there that they were carrying him off on a ship to a distant land. I saw what a trouble they had. Shut they could manage him, because he had become weak on the earth. They laid him in coils and circles. I heard how he wringled and wrangled when they laid him down and when he slipped away from them out there. They held on to him with all their might. Ever so many hands had hold of him, but he kept slipping away from them down to the bottom. There he is lying now, till further notice, I rather think." "He is quite thin," said the small fishes. "They have starved him," said the seal. "But he'll soon come to himself and get his old size and corpulence again. I suppose he is the great sea-serpent that men are so afraid of and talk so much about. I never saw him before, and never believed in a sea-serpent. Now I do. I believe he is the sea-serpent." And with that, down went the seal. "How much he knew! How he talked!" said the small fishes. "I never was so wise before. If it only isn't all an untruth." "We can, anyway, swim down and see for ourselves," said the littlest fish. "On the way, we can hear what the others think about it." "I wouldn't make a stroke with my fins to get at something to know," said the others, and turned away. "But I would," said the littlest fellow, and put off down into deep water. But it was a good distance from the place where the long thing that sank lay. The little fish looked and hunted on all sides down in the deep water. Never before had it imagined the world to be so big. The herrings went in great shoals, shining like a mighty ribbon of silver. The mackerel followed after and looked even finer. There were fishes there of all fashions and marked with every possible color. Jellyfish, like half-transparent flowers, borne along by the currents. Great plants grew up from the floor of the ocean, grass fathoms long, and palm-like trees, every leaf tenanted by shining shellfish. At last the little fish spied a long dark streak away down, and made his way toward it, but it was neither fish nor cable. It was the gunwale of a sunken vessel, which above and below the deck was broken in two by the force of the sea. The little fish swam into the cabin, where the people who perished when the vessel sank were all washed away, except two. A young woman lay there stretched out, with her little child in her arms. They seemed to be sleeping. The little fish was quite frightened, for it did not know that they could never again waken. Seaweed hung like a network of foliage over the gunwale above the two beautiful bodies of mother and babe. It was so quiet, so solitary. The little fish scampered away as fast as it could, out where the water was bright and clear, and there were fishes to see. It had not gone far before it met a whale, fearfully big. "Don't swallow me," cried the little fish. "I am not even to be tasted. I am so small, and it's a great comfort for me to live." "What are you doing away down here, where your kind never come?" asked the Whale. So then the little fish told about the astonishingly long eel, or whatever the thing was, that had sunk down from above, and produced such a panic amongst all the other creatures in the sea. "Ho, ho!" said the Whale, and he drew in such a rush of water he was ready to make a prodigious spout when he came to the surface for a breath. "Ho, ho! So that was the thing that tickled me on the back when I was turning round. I thought it was a ship's mast that I could break up into clothespins. But it was not here that it was. No, a good deal farther out lies the thing. I'll go with you and look for it, for I have nothing else to do." And so it swam off, and the little fish behind it, not too near, because there was a tearing stream, as it were, in the wake of the Whale. They met a shark and an old sawfish. They too had heard of the famous sea eel, so long and so thin. They had not seen it, but now they would. "I'll go with you," said the shark, who was on the same road. "If the Great Sea-Serpent is no thicker than a cable, then I can bite through it in one bite." And he opened his mouth and showed his 6 rows of teeth. "I can bite dents in a ship's anchor, and certainly can bite off the shank." "There it is," said the great Whale. "I see him." He thought he saw better than the others. "See how it rises, how it bends and bows and curves." But it was not a sea serpent, but an extraordinarily great eel, ever so many ells long, that grew near. "Why, I've seen him before," said the sawfish. "He has never made a hullabaloo in the sea, or frightened any big fish out of his wits." And so they talked to him of the new eel, and asked if he would go with them on their voyage of discovery. "If that eel is longer than I am," said the sea eel, "there will be something disagreeable happening." "Aye, that there will," said the others, "but there are enough of us not to tolerate him." And so they shot ahead. But then there came right in their way a great monster, bigger than all of them put together. It looked like a floating island that could not stop itself. It was a venerable whale. Its head was grown over with seaweed, its back covered with barnacles, and such innumerable oysters and mussels that its black skin was altogether whitened. "Come with us, old fellow," said they. "Here's a new fish come, and we won't stand it." "I would rather lie where I am lying," said the Whale. "Leave me alone, leave me alone. Oh, I suffer from the dreadful disease. My only relief is to get up toward the surface and get my back up higher. Then the great sea fowl can come and pick at me. That feels so good, only when they do not drive their beaks in too far. Sometimes they go in too deep, quite into my blubber. You can see now how a complete skeleton of a fowl is fixed on my back. She struck her claws in too deep, and could not get them out when I went down to the bottom. And now the little fishes have picked at her. See how she looks, and how I look. I am all diseased." "That is all imagination," said the shark. "I am never sick. No fish is ever sick." "Pardon me," said the Whale. "The eel suffers from headache, the carp has the smallpox, and we all have intestinal worms." "Nonsense," said the shark, and refused to hear any further, and the others would also rather not. They had something else to attend to. At last they came to the place where the telegraph cable lay. It has a pretty long bed on the floor of the sea from Europe to America, over sandbanks and sea mud, rocky ground and weedy places, entire forests of coral. The currents down there, too, change. Whirlpools eddy, and fishes swarm in greater masses than the countless flocks of birds that men see when birds of passage take their flight. There is a stir, a splashing there, a humming and rushing. The rushing still haunts a little the great empty conch shells when we hold them to our ears. "There lies the fellow!" cried all the great fishes, and the little one with them. They saw the cable, the beginning and end of which vanished beyond the reach of their eyes. Sponges and polyps swayed from the ground, rose and fell over it so that now it was hidden, now came to view. Sea porcupines, snails, and worms moved over it. Gigantic crabs that had a complete fringe of creeping things stalked about it. Dark sea anemones, or whatever the creature is called that eats with its entire body, lay beside it and smelled of the new creature that had stretched itself on the bottom of the sea. Flounders and codfish turned over in the water so as to get an idea about it from all sides. The starfish, that always bores down into the mud and can keep its eyes outside, lay and stared to see what was to come of all this bustle. The telegraph cable lay without stirring, but life and thought were in it. Human thought went through it. "The thing is crafty," said the whale. "It is able to strike me in the stomach, and that is my weak point."
"Let us grope along," said the polyps. "I have long arms and limber fingers. I have been moving by the side of it. Now I'll go a little faster."
And so it stretched its most flexible, longest arms down the cable and around it.
"It has no scales," said the polyps. "It has no skin at all. I do believe it never feeds its own young."
The sea eel laid itself by the side of the telegraph cable and stretched out as far as it could. "The thing is longer than I am," it said, "but it's not length that does anything. One must have skin, stomach, and flexibility." The whale dove down deeper than it had ever been. "Art thou fish, or art thou plant?" it asked. "Or art thou only some piece of work made up above that cannot thrive down here amongst us?" The telegraph cable did not answer. It has no power for that. Yet thoughts go through it, men's thoughts, that rush in 1 second miles upon miles from land to land. "Will you answer, or will you take a crack?" asked the fierce shark, and all the other great fishes asked the same thing. The cable did not stir, but it had its private thought, and such a one it had a right to have when it was full of thoughts. "Let them only give me a crack, then I shall be hauled up and be myself again. That has happened to others of my race in shallower waters." So it gave no answer. It had something else to attend to. It telegraphed and lay in its lawful place at the bottom of the ocean. Up above, the sun now went down, as men say. It became like flaming fire, and all the clouds glowed with fiery color, each more splendid than the other.
"Now we shall get the red light," said the polyps, "and can see the thing better if need be."
At it," shouted the shark. "At it," said the swordfish and the whale and the eel. They rushed forward, the shark foremost, but just as it was about to grip the wire, the swordfish, out of pure politeness, ran his saw right into the back of the shark. It was a great mistake, and the shark lost all its strength for biting. There was a hubbub down in the mud. Great fishes and small sea anemones and snails rushed at one another, ate each other, mashed and squeezed in. The cable lay quietly and attended to its affairs, and that one ought to do. The dark night brooded over them, but the ocean's millions upon millions of living creatures lighted it. Crawfish, not so big as a pinhead, gave out light. Some were so small that it took 1,000 to make one pinhead, yet they gave light. It certainly is wonderful, but that's the way it is. These sea creatures looked at the telegraph wire. "What is that thing?" they asked, "and what isn't it?" That was the question. Then there came an old sea cow. Folks on the earth call its kind a mermaid, or else a merman. This was a she, had a tail and 2 short arms to splash with, hanging breasts, and seaweed and sponges on her head, and that was what she was proud of.
"Will you have the society of intelligent people?" said she. "I am the only one down here that can give it, but I ask in return for a perfectly secure pasturage on the bottom of the sea for me and mine. I am a fish, as you see, and I am also an amphibious animal. With practice, I am the wisest cow in the sea. I know about everything that goes on down here, and all that goes on above. The thing that you are pondering over is from above, and whatever plumps down from up there is either dead or comes to be dead and powerless. Let it lie there for what it is. It's only some invention of man."
"Now I think there is something more to it," said the little fish.
"Hold your tongue, mackerel,"
said the great sea cow. "Stickleback," said the rest, and that was even more insulting. And the sea cow explained to them that this terrible thing, which to be sure had not given out a single mutter, was only some invention from the dry land. And it delivered a little oration on the rottenness of men.
"They want to get a hold of us," said she. "That's all they live for. They stretch nets for us, and come with bait on a hook to catch us. That stupid thing there is some kind of big string, which they think we are going to bite at. They are such stupids. We are not. Only do not touch it, and it will shrivel up and all turn to dust and mud. Everything that comes down from up there is full of cracks and breaks and is good for nothing."
"Good for nothing," said all the creatures in the sea, and held fast to the Sea Cow's opinion, so as to have an opinion. The little fish had its own thoughts. "That exceedingly long, thin serpent is perhaps the most wonderful fish in the ocean. I have a feeling it is." "The very most wonderful," say we human folks, and say it with knowledge and assurance. "It is the Great Sea-Serpent, long ago the theme of song and story. It was born and nourished and sprang forth from men's cunning, and was laid upon the bottom of the sea, stretching from the eastern to the western land, bearing messages quick as light flashes to our earth. It grows in might and in length, grows year by year, through all seas, round the world, beneath the stormy waves and the lucid waters, where the skipper looks down as if he sailed through transparent air, and sees a swimming fish, brilliant fireworks of color. Down, far down, stretches the serpent, Midgard's snake, that bites its own tail as it encircles the earth. Fish and shell beat upon it with their heads. They understand not the thing. It is from above. Men's thoughts in all language course through it noiselessly. The serpent of science for good and evil, Midgard's snake, the most wonderful of all the ocean's wonders, our Great Sea-Serpent." End of The Great Sea-Serpent, Section 23. Recording by April Walters.